when 6-year-old Olivia insisted her deceased mother visited her at school every day. Her father, Michael, brushed it off as imagination. But when others began seeing a woman who looked exactly like his late wife, doubt turned to fear. Determined to uncover the truth, Michael dug deeper, only to make a discovery so shocking it would change everything he believed about his past. Stick around to witness the mystery unfold. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more intriguing stories. Let's dive in. The morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen blinds as Michael Harris scrambled to keep up with the usual chaos. One hand poured coffee into his travel mug while the other reached for Olivia's backpack, double-checking that she hadn't forgotten anything. His 6-year-old daughter, Ever the Chatterbox, sat on the edge of the couch, swinging her legs as she struggled to slip on her sneakers. "Come on, sweetheart, we're running late," he called out, taking a hurried sip of coffee before wincing. Too hot, too strong, too much like his life these days. It had been over a year since Rachel died, a year of aching quiet, a year of learning how to be both father and mother to Olivia. He still wasn't sure if he was doing any of it right, but they were managing, or at least he thought they were. Then Olivia spoke. "Daddy, I see Mommy at school every day." The words landed like a hammer to his chest. He nearly dropped the coffee mug, the scorching liquid sloshing over the rim, burning his fingers. He barely felt it. His pulse roared in his ears as he turned slowly to face her, his throat tightening around the lump that had instantly formed. "What did you just say, sweetheart?" His voice came out quieter than he intended, barely more than a whisper. Olivia, completely unaware of the weight her words carried, grinned as she finally got her sneakers on. "I see Mommy. She's always there, watching me during recess. Sometimes she even waves." Michael forced a breath through his nose, steadying himself. His mind scrambled for a rational explanation. It had to be some sort of coping mechanism, the way children process grief. He knelt in front of her, brushing a stray curl from her face, trying to keep his voice light. "Sweetie, you know Mommy isn't here anymore, right?" For the first time, Olivia's smile wavered. Her small hands gripped the straps of her backpack as she looked up at him, eyes filled with something unreadable. "You don't have to believe me, Daddy," she said softly. "But I know it's her." A chill snaked down Michael's spine. He wanted to dismiss it, to brush it off as childhood imagination. But something in Olivia's voice, her certainty, made it impossible to ignore. By the time he dropped her off at Brookwood Elementary, his hands were still clammy on the steering wheel. As he drove away, a gnawing unease settled in his chest. That night, he picked up his phone and called Dr. Patel, the child psychologist who had helped Olivia process Rachel's death. The therapist listened patiently as Michael explained what Olivia had said. "It's not uncommon," Dr. Patel reassured him. "Children cope with loss in different ways. Sometimes they create comforting illusions, visions of their loved ones. It's their way of making sense of the absence." Michael exhaled slowly, his shoulders sagging, a rational explanation. That was all he needed. He thanked Dr. Patel and hung up, determined to put the unsettling conversation behind him. But the relief didn't last. The next day, Olivia came home with a smudge of chocolate on her school shirt. Michael barely noticed at first, preoccupied with making dinner, but when she climbed onto the kitchen stool, swinging her legs and grinning, she said something that made his blood run cold. "Mommy gave me a cookie today." Michael's hands stilled over the cutting board. He turned slowly, his breath catching in his throat. "What do you mean, Olivia?" She looked at him with wide, innocent eyes. "She gave me a chocolate chip cookie, my favorite. A simple stain, a childish story." It should have meant nothing, but something deep in Michael's gut twisted with unease. He couldn't ignore it anymore. Michael parked outside Brookwood Elementary the next morning, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. The conversation with Olivia had left him shaken, and even though part of him still clung to logic, another part, the part that hadn't slept last night, needed answers. He walked Olivia into her classroom, then sought out Miss Lawson, her teacher. She was in her late 40s, warm and no-nonsense, the kind of woman who had seen everything a classroom could throw at her. When Michael hesitantly explained what Olivia had been saying, he expected a polite chuckle, a dismissive wave of the hand. Instead, Miss Lawson's face darkened. She glanced around the hallway before lowering her voice. "Mr. Harris, I think we should talk in private." Michael's heart pounded as he followed her into her office. Once the door was shut, she took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around a pen on her desk. "You're not the only one who's noticed something strange," she admitted. Michael stiffened. What do you mean? Miss Lawson hesitated. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, several teachers, and even a few parents, have reported seeing a woman near the schoolyard. A woman who, she swallowed, who looks exactly like Rachel. A cold dread filled Michael's chest. A chill ran down his spine. She never speaks to anyone, Miss Lawson continued. Just watches, especially during recess. Michael's fingers curled into fists, his mind racing. He had come here expecting to hear that Olivia's words were nothing more than the fantasies of a grieving child. But this was something else entirely. Was someone watching Olivia? Was Olivia really seeing something? Or worse, was she seeing someone? Michael left Miss Lawson's office feeling like the ground beneath him had shifted. He had come seeking reassurances. A simple explanation that would confirm Olivia's words were nothing more than the imagination of a grieving child. Instead, he walked away with the unsettling knowledge that Olivia wasn't the only one who had seen the woman. Someone who looked exactly like Rachel had been lurking near the school, watching. That night, sleep was impossible. He lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythmic ticking of the clock on his nightstand. His mind raced through possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. If someone had been watching Olivia, who were they? What did they want? The idea that his daughter had been waving at a stranger, believing it was her mother, made his stomach churn. By morning, exhaustion clung to him, but a sharper resolve had taken its place. If someone was out there, he was going to find out who it was. Michael parked his car across the street from Brookwood Elementary, positioning himself where he had a clear view of the playground. His fingers tapped impatiently against the steering wheel as he scanned the schoolyard, watching children scatter across the grass in bursts of laughter and motion. Olivia ran toward the swings, her pigtails bouncing as she joined her friends. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Teachers kept a watchful eye on the kids, and a handful of parents stood near the parking lot, chatting. Michael felt foolish sitting there, but just as he was beginning to think that maybe he was letting his imagination get the best of him, a movement near the fence caught his eye. There, partially hidden behind an oak tree, stood a woman. Michael's breath hitched. His fingers clenched around the steering wheel as he focused on her. She wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. Long dark hair was pulled back into a low ponytail. A pale blue sweater hugged her frame. The way she stood, the way her posture slumped just slightly, was eerily familiar. His heartbeat thundered in his ears as he waited for her to do something, to turn, to walk away. But she didn't. She remained there, fixated on the playground, her attention locked onto Olivia. A ripple of unease ran through him. He had spent years memorizing Rachel's face, her mannerisms, the way she tilted her head when deep in thought. This woman, she looked just like her. Across the schoolyard, Miss Lawson's expression changed. She had seen her, too. Michael watched as she took a hesitant step forward. Then another. She called out, her voice carrying over the playground noise. The woman's head snapped up, eyes wide with shock, and in that split second, her eyes met Michael's. A jolt of something, recognition, fear, disbelief, flashed across her face. Then, she turned and bolted. Michael shot out of his car, his pulse spiking as he sprinted toward the fence. He shoved past a group of parents, ignoring the startled glances they threw his way. He ran hard, fast, but by the time he reached the spot where she had been standing, she was gone. There was no sign of her, no lingering presence, no retreating figure in the distance, only the rustling of leaves and the fading echoes of recess chatter. But something was left behind. Near the base of the tree, something small and metallic glinted in the sunlight. Michael bent down, his fingers closing around a locket. His breath caught in his throat as he turned it over in his hands. It was old, worn, slightly tarnished, and yet unmistakable. Rachel had one exactly like it. His fingers fumbled as he pried it open. Inside was a tiny photograph. 2 young girls, identical. Michael's entire world tilted as the realization hit him like a freight train. This wasn't Rachel. This was someone else. Michael barely felt his legs as he made his way back to his car, his mind spinning. He couldn't take his eyes off the locket. Couldn't shake the feeling that he had just uncovered something far bigger than he had ever imagined. Rachel had never mentioned having a twin. Not once. In all their years together, through all the conversations they had shared, she had never spoken of a sister. Had she known? Had she been keeping a secret, or had it been kept from her as well? The only people who could answer that question were Rachel's parents. Without hesitation, Michael started the car and pulled away from the school, gripping the locket so tightly in his palm that the edges dug into his skin. He needed answers, and he needed them now. Michael drove with a singular focus, his grip tightening around the steering wheel as the weight of what he had discovered pressed down on him. The locket sat on the passenger seat, its presence more unsettling than he wanted to admit. A piece of Rachel's past, one she had never spoken of, had resurfaced, and now he needed answers. When he arrived at Margaret and Edward's house, he barely took a breath before knocking. The door opened within seconds, and Margaret's expression shifted from pleasant surprise to concern as she took in his face. Without a word, Michael stepped inside, the locket held out in his hand. Margaret's eyes widened the moment she saw it. Her fingers trembled slightly, but she didn't reach for it. Edward entered the room behind her, his posture stiffening at the sight. The silence between them was thick, filled with unspoken truths that had long been buried. Michael placed the locket on the coffee table, watching as Margaret slowly lowered herself onto the couch, her breath uneven. Edward remained standing, rubbing his temples, as if bracing for something inevitable. The truth came in slow, fractured pieces. Rachel had a twin, Elise. They had been separated as children, a decision made in secrecy, buried under the weight of family conflicts and choices that had never been revisited. Margaret's parents had insisted on it, believing it was for the best, though even she struggled to say why. Over time, it became easier to pretend Elise had never existed. Rachel had never known, never suspected that a part of her had been erased. Michael struggled to absorb it. The idea that Rachel had gone her entire life without knowing the truth was staggering. But what unsettled him even more was the question that followed. If Elise had been gone all these years, why had she returned now? Michael couldn't let it rest. He spent the next several days following leads, piecing together what little information he had. The locket, the sighting at Olivia's school, the car that had been spotted near the playground. It all pointed to one conclusion: Elise had been watching them for longer than he realized. With the help of a neighbor who had noticed the unfamiliar car, he finally traced her to a small, nondescript motel on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where people went to disappear. Standing outside the room, he hesitated for only a moment before knocking. The door creaked open, revealing Elise. The resemblance was staggering. Rachel's face stared back at him, yet the woman before him carried a weight that made her seem older, more worn by time. She didn't speak right away, her expression unreadable, but the flicker of recognition in her eyes confirmed what he already knew. She had been waiting for this moment. Inside, the room was sparse, barely lived in. Elise moved carefully, her fingers twitching as if unsure of what to do with them. Michael didn't sit. He stood near the door, watching her as she settled onto the edge of the bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her story unraveled in quiet, hesitant confessions. She had only recently learned of Rachel's death. The news had shaken her, sending her searching for the sister she had never known. But by the time she found her way back, it was too late. She hadn't known how to approach Michael, how to explain who she was, so she had kept her distance, lingering on the edges of their lives. Watching Olivia had been her way of connecting, of seeing the family she had lost before she ever had the chance to claim them. She hadn't meant to frighten them. She had simply wanted to see them, even if from afar. Michael's emotions warred within him. A part of him understood, but another part couldn't ignore the unease. She had been a stranger lurking in the background of Olivia's life, a figure shrouded in secrecy, and yet she wasn't a stranger at all. She was family. He left without making any promises, his mind tangled in too many thoughts to process. The road home felt longer that night, stretching endlessly before him. At the house, Olivia was already asleep, curled beneath her blankets, her small chest rising and falling in steady breaths. Michael stood in the doorway for a long time, watching her, wondering if he had just uncovered something that would change her life forever. Elise wasn't a ghost. She wasn't an illusion or a figment of Olivia's grief. She was real, and now she was part of their story. Michael barely slept that night. His mind refused to rest. He sat in the dim light of the living room, the locket resting on the coffee table in front of him, like a relic from a life he had never known existed. His mind kept circling back to Elise's confession, to the raw pain in her voice when she spoke of Rachel, of what she had lost before she ever had the chance to claim it. Yet, despite the tragedy in her story, something inside him remained conflicted. She had been watching Olivia. She had been standing outside of a schoolyard, looking in, It was unsettling, no matter her intentions. But was it something more than that? Was it simply grief manifesting in an awkward, almost desperate way? Or was there something Elise wasn't telling him? As dawn crept in through the windows, he finally exhaled and rubbed his hands over his face. No matter how much he analyzed it, one fact remained. Elise was family. She wasn't going away, and now he had to decide what to do about it. The morning felt heavier than usual. Olivia was her usual cheerful self, sitting at the kitchen counter, swinging her feet as she ate cereal. She hummed to herself between spoonfuls, completely oblivious to the storm inside her father's head. Michael sat across from her, barely touching his coffee. The thought of bringing Elise into Olivia's life felt monumental, like he was stepping into unknown territory with no map to guide him. But deep down, he knew there was no avoiding it. Elise had already become a presence, a shadow lingering just beyond reach. The longer he kept her away, the more it would feel like another lie, another truth stolen from Olivia, just as it had been stolen from Rachel. That afternoon, he picked Olivia up from school, and instead of driving home, he took a detour. The ride was quiet, Olivia watching the passing houses with curiosity before finally asking where they were going. Michael hesitated before answering, his voice careful. "There's someone I want you to meet." She didn't press him for details, but she watched him closely, as if sensing that something important was about to happen. When they pulled up in front of the small motel where Elise was staying, Michael felt the weight of what he was about to do settle heavily on his shoulders. He turned to Olivia, taking in the way her hands fiddled with the hem of her dress, the way she looked up at him with silent questions in her big brown eyes. Michael stepped out first, scanning the parking lot before leading her toward Elise's door. His knock was firm, and after a few seconds, the door creaked open. Elise stood there, her face unreadable, though her eyes flickered immediately to Olivia. Michael felt the moment stretch between them, something fragile and uncertain settling in the space. He cleared his throat, shifting slightly. "Olivia, this is Elise." Olivia stared up at her, blinking. Then, ever so slowly, she tilted her head to the side, examining her with the same quiet curiosity she gave to new people. Michael could see the struggle in Elise's face, the way she held back as if afraid to move too quickly. Her hands stayed at her sides, her lips pressed together as if she were waiting for Olivia to make the first move. For a long time, Olivia said nothing. Then, in a small voice, she asked, "Why do you look like my mommy?" Michael's chest tightened at the question, but it was Elise who finally spoke, her voice gentle. "Because I was her sister." Elise didn't push, and Michael was grateful for that. Over the next few days, she remained patient, keeping her presence small but steady. They met in neutral places, parks, coffee shops, where Olivia could observe without pressure. At first, the little girl remained guarded, staying close to Michael, watching Elise with careful eyes. But Elise never forced anything. She didn't bombard Olivia with questions or attempt to claim a place that wasn't hers. She simply existed in the background, waiting for Olivia to decide. It happened gradually, in tiny moments. A hesitant question here, a lingering glance there. Olivia would stare at Elise when she thought she wasn't looking, her young mind trying to piece together what it meant to have someone who looked so much like her mother, but was someone else entirely. One evening, Michael watched as Olivia finally broke the silence that had stretched between them for days. "You have the same hair as Mommy." Her voice was soft, almost hesitant, as she reached out, brushing a small hand against Elise's sleeve. Elise smiled, though her eyes shone with something deeper. "We were twins," she said. "Like you and me, in a way." For the first time, Olivia didn't pull away. The visit to Rachel's grave was inevitable, a step Michael knew they all needed to take. The day was overcast, the air cool but not unwelcoming. Elise stood by the headstone, her fingers grazing the engraved letters, her expression unreadable. Michael kept a careful watch, unsure of what emotions might unfold in the quiet of the cemetery. Olivia stood beside Elise, her small hands clasped together as she read the name out loud, as if confirming that this was, indeed, the mother she had lost. Elise kneeled beside her, her movements slow, reverent. After a moment, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled something out. The locket. She placed it at the base of the headstone, the tarnished metal catching a sliver of sunlight. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though Michael wasn't sure if the words were meant for Rachel, for Olivia, or for herself. When it was time to leave, Olivia reached for Elise's hand. The gesture was small, but it was enough. A new chapter was beginning, As they walked back toward the car, Michael looked at Elise, really looked at her. She wasn't Rachel, and she never would be. But she was here, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Michael had spent so long clinging to the past, to the idea that life after Rachel would always feel like a wound that refused to heal. But as he watched his daughter walk hand in hand with the woman who had once been a stranger, he realized that grief didn't have to mean loneliness. Elise had lost a sister she had never known, but in return, she had found something else, something she never expected. A chance to be part of a family, to step into the life she had been denied all those years ago. And for Michael, it wasn't about replacing Rachel or rewriting history. It was about moving forward, about giving Olivia the chance to know a love that had been lost before it ever had the chance to grow. As they drove home, Olivia dozed off in the back seat, her tiny fingers still curled around Elise's hand. Michael exhaled, feeling something settle in his chest. It wasn't closure, not entirely, but it was something close to peace. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. Life has a way of revealing truths when we least expect them, but how we choose to move forward defines who we are. Michael faced a choice that many of us never will, but his story raises an important question. Is blood enough to make someone family, or is it the bonds we choose to build that truly matter? What if everything you believed about your family was a carefully kept secret? Share your perspective in the comments, and if this story resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe for more powerful and thought-provoking stories. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.